folks filter in, and then we'll begin shortly. Obviously, it's only 7:01 p.m. at this time, but we'll begin shortly. Thank you all for joining us. Good evening, all. Thank you so much for taking the time to join this event this evening. This is the first event of a series of events. So we're excited to get kicked off, and we'll be discussing at the end what the other events are. Of course, there are consecutive weeks starting today on Tuesdays. All right, folks, it's about 7:04. Let me take a look to see how many we have joined us so far. We'll be starting shortly. We have 40 individuals with us. So thank you, Jeff, for sending that into the chat. As Jeff mentioned in the chat, so there are two functions that can be used throughout this webinar. First and foremost, there is the Q&A. So please feel free to share any questions that way. And then also there's a chat function that many people have already found. Yes, Virginia. So given that it's a webinar format, there's not going to be like a attendee list that you'll see other folks. But if you have any questions or want to know anything, please do let us know. Send them to the chat, or, and we'll get your questions answered. Okay, it's 7:06 p.m. So I think we do want to get started. So once again, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Today is the first of 4 webinars that a New Jersey coalition, we've dubbed ourselves a Coalition to Support Palestinian Liberation, are working to continue the conversation on Palestine. Of course, Palestine has come to the forefront of the conversation in the mainstream media, given the Zionist massacre in Gaza back in May. But the real challenge is being able to continue on the conversation, right? Not to just get onto a bandwagon when it's hot or when things are heated, but rather to continue the effort to educate, to continue the effort to talk about injustices, Palestine and beyond, at times where maybe folks aren't really paying attention as much. So thank you so much. I want to really give a shout out to everybody who's put so much effort into organizing this. I'm with the American Muslims for Palestine of New Jersey. I want to give a big thank you to the Jewish Voice for Peace Northern New Jersey chapter, New Jersey Peace Action, the Palestinian American Community Center located in Clifton, and People's Organization for Progress. So thank you everybody for all the effort that you've put in. I'm excited to be the one to kick off this series of events. And of course, I hope that I'm not going to scare anybody away. I hope you still join the other ones after this one, but I'm confident that you will. All right, so to get to our conversation for this evening, today we're going to be discussing, let me just get we're going to be discussing Palestinian history, but from a different lens than we're used to seeing in mainstream media. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I hope that. Okay. Please forgive me. Okay. So countering the Zionist narrative. Please feel free to share any questions in the chat. Jeff, I am in the presenter view of the presentation. So please just do send me a text or let me know if there are any questions or anything that I should pay attention to as I speak. I hope not to be the one who just rambles on and just goes over everything. At the end of the conversation, we're going to have a Q&A section for everybody to share any questions or make any points that they'd like to. So countering the Zionist narrative, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I like to think myself as somewhat of a clever individual. And I usually like to begin by giving everybody a moment to just soak in this opening slide and kind of take a look at it and see if there is anything that stands out to you that, is worth mentioning. I want to give everybody a second, take a look. Do let me know, send it to the chat. I want to see if anybody has any thoughts. We're going to take about 30 seconds, share some thoughts on this first slide for me in the chat. Awesome, I can see the chat. So generally speaking, when an issue like Palestine is discussed in, as a broader conversation, especially in media like the American media, what is on the forefront is focus on the narrative of those who are doing the oppressing, right? So for example, countering the Zionist narrative. Now, is it effective to discuss the history of Palestine from the lens of the colonizers' perspective? Or would it be beneficial to take it from the angle of those who are being marginalized, who are being oppressed? Secondly, is referring to this conversation as a conflict, right? Reason being, well, we'll get to that in a moment, actually. So I think, so as I go back to the front, right, the first slide, second slide, identifying issues with the conversation that we have in mainstream today, and then kind of correcting ourselves, right? Because when we do this type of work, we do organizing for, oppressed peoples, and we try to bring out the message and we try to put them on the forefront. That's always the goal, just that, putting the marginalized, oppressed individuals out on the forefront. So instead of countering the Zionist narrative, something more along the lines of reclaiming Palestinian history. As folks doing work or focused on social justice, it is our responsibility to be very responsible with the rhetoric, with the language that we use when having these discussions, right? And then finally, the Zionist occupation of Palestine. Now, why? Why the Zionist occupation of Palestine as opposed to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict? And I think this is a very, very important concept for everybody to kind of become familiar with, because we are always hearing in the news, like the reporting back in May, or just general conversation where it's referred to as a conflict. But why is it not a conflict? Right? So what is a conflict? The Merriam-Webster dictionary quite literally defines a conflict as a disagreement or an argument. More specifically, a long-lasting disagreement or argument. Now, what is the term conflict insinuate? It insinuates that there are two sides who have independent will, who have self-determination and make their own decisions. It implies that the two sides are at minimum similar, if not then equal power, right? Equal control. And then finally, that there's a basic respect for human existence. Now, what situation are we looking at now? What we're looking at is settler colonialism. And now what is that? It's a formation of colonies in a foreign land, right? The United States, Canada, Australia, so many examples of settler colonial countries and how they came to be. Now, what are attributes of a settler colonial relationship? It's a oppressor-oppressed relationship. There is a monopoly of power and control, something that we're going to be covering throughout, or a monopoly of power and control is going to be a theme throughout this evening's conversation. And then finally, there's a marginalization of the indigenous folks. And in order for a settler colonial nation to be successful, right, there needs to be that marginalization of the indigenous. Why? Because you need to suppress their identities, suppress their ability to speak up for themselves. Because in a settler colonial society, the colonizer needs to put their identity on the forefront to claim legitimacy in land, right? We never talk about the native folks in this country. We never talk about the true history. We don't talk about what lands we stand on, right? I always say that we'd be remiss if we didn't say constantly in any setting that we all sit together, that we don't say that we stand today, we live today, we benefit today off of Lenape land, and the unfortunate and horrendous oppression of the Lenape people, and of course beyond that across the United States. And so, we don't talk about their story. We don't talk about their land. We don't talk about what was done. And that is because it goes hand in hand with legitimizing the Israeli identity with, our Israeli claim to Palestine or American claim to the United States and so on and so forth. So that again brings us back to the concept of being very responsible with the rhetoric that we use and the way we frame the conversation in our settings. Because if we are not careful, then we let these things seep into our conversations, and that really, really waters down the movement. It really, really waters down the fight for oppression. And to say that it waters it down is a very soft way of saying it. So now we talked about settler colonialism, right? What is the driving force of the colonization of Palestine? Well, I don't know if anybody's familiar with the concept of Zionism. What is Zionism? Zionism is a political movement for the establishment of a Jewish national community in Palestine. And so I know, like I said, a lot of folks on here are probably Jewish identifying. So I know I don't have to say it to you, but of course, Zionism and the acquisition of the Holy Land for the state of Israel is not representative of all Jewish people in any way, shape, or form, right? Just got to get that out of the way. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but that's why it starts with it being a political movement. Now, Zionism calls for a Jewish homeland in the Holy Land based on political aspirations, right? Now, we're not talking about the religious Jewish claim to Jerusalem, to Judea and Samaria. And I'll be honest with you, I have no problem with referring to as Judea and Samaria because we're talking, historical, biblical, history from the Torah, history from the Quran, and but the issue doesn't come with saying the land means something to a people or they have a connection to it, but rather it becomes political. It becomes an issue when there's a degree of supremacy, right? When it becomes an ethno state. And then, I hope that one day, I think that we'll be covering and talking about the marginalization of Jews of color in Israel and what that looks like nowadays. Because again, when we call it a ethno supremacy state, that also applies within the Jewish religion, and how Jews of color from Ethiopia, from other parts of Africa, from North Africa and other areas in the world are treated in Israeli streets, by Israeli courts, by Israeli police, very, very similar to what we see in the United States today. Zionism creates the full story of fighting between Jews and Arabs for 3,000 plus years. So I put Jews and Arabs very intentionally here. Why? Because first and foremost, the success of the Zionist narrative relies on making Zionism something in common for all Jewish people. Right, because if you begin to break down the reality of how Zionism exists today and you connect Zionism to white supremacy and the annexation of land and the state of Israel being a European outpost in the Middle East, then it becomes a flawed theory, right? It becomes a theory that is vulnerable when you call it a white supremacist state as opposed to a religious safe haven as the narrative is being pushed. And then secondly, Arabs. The word Arabs has always been used in the conversation around Zionism because it simply eliminates the Palestinian identity. I know we've all heard before, well, why do they want to be there? They being Palestinians. There are X amount of Arab countries in the world. There are X amount of Muslim countries in the world. Yeah, but I'm not from Saudi Arabia. I'm not from Syria. My roots, my culture, my people are Palestinian, right? So using the word Arab erases the idea and identity of Palestinian and what comes with that. And then finally, the concept of 3,000 plus years. We've heard many times that this is an issue that's been going on for thousands of years and it's never going to be resolved. First and foremost, if anybody studies history and actually knows their history, they would understand that in reality, if we're going to break it down, the Muslim and Jewish history is actually a history of, allyship, is a history of, coordination. And in reality, I hope I don't insult anybody here, but like it was actually, the Crusaders and then the Jews and the Muslims who associated with one another. So if we're talking about long standing beef, it's definitely not between Jews and Arabs or Jews and Muslims. And then finally, Zionist aspirations began as early as the 1870s with the actions to achieve those aspirations a decade later. So that's when the conversation around Zionism started in the late 1870s. And we'll talk about how that's relevant and important in a bit. So Palestine before Zionism, it's very important to talk about Palestine as a rich culture, as having a rich history, and having, lots of, tangible long-term existence. For example, as you can see at the top left, we see currency. If you look closely, Palestine 1937, there's actually Arabic in Palestine and then also in Hebrew, which I assume says Palestine, but I cannot read Hebrew. I'm just going to check into the, yeah, I definitely agree. What time is it now? 7:20. A minute ago, Marta sent into the Q&A that Jews were in part sent in by European colonial powers as a way to get Palestine for Europe. That's why I refer to Israel as a European outpost in the Middle East, right? Because it is a military strategically um, a strategic military advantage and so on and so forth. Okay, so back to the slide. Palestine at one point was one of the largest exporters of oranges in the world. You can see Palestinian tourist literature, and then finally sporting in Palestine to the bottom left is a soccer team. And then actually I was talking about the currency in the writing in Hebrew and in Arabic, and we're going to be talking that, and I believe in the next slide, and talk about how prior to Zionism, prior to Herzl, prior to the colonial imperial involvement in this equation, that people of the Jewish faith, people of the Christian faith, people of the Muslim faith existed as Palestinians in the Holy Land collectively. So European Jewish immigration to Palestine, I don't know if anybody here is, I'm sure you are familiar with the term aliyah, which means elevation or going up. That is the term used to label these periods of immigration to Palestine. So there are a total of 3. We're going to be covering 2 primarily because the third was, I think, significantly smaller than the first 2. Excuse me. So the first aliyah was an estimated of 25,000 to 35,000 European Jews immigrating to Ottoman Palestine. And that word Ottoman is important. Ottoman Palestine between 1881 and 1903. Second aliyah was an estimated 35,000 European Jews immigrating to Ottoman Palestine between 1904 and 1914. The third aliyah took place between 1919 and 1923, so right up to the end of World War I. And now the general I apologize for cutting out. Now, there's a misconception here that Zionism in Israel was connected to the Holocaust. The historical context shows that prior to the start of the Holocaust, there was, as I mentioned, as early as 1870, conversation around Zionism and building this idea of an ethnocratic country. Now, it wasn't at the start strictly in relation to Palestine. There's actually different lands discussed. As I mentioned, Ethiopia, I think, was one of them. And I believe there was a region in South America that was discussed. And then, of course, the Holy Land. But now that isn't to say that there was no oppression of Jews in Europe prior to the Holocaust. Right? We know again, factually speaking, the pogroms in Russia and other systemic policies that Jews were targeted with in many places in Europe, in this country, in the United States of America, and other places in the world. So my point is strictly to say that it's a misconception that Zionism in Israel was connected to the Holocaust, but of course, prior to the Holocaust, there was a lot of marginalization and oppression of Jewish people in Europe. And again, prior to Zionism coming to the Holy Land, Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived as Palestinians in the land. We do have many Jews who are of older age who still talk about the relationship prior to Zionism coming into play, and talking about how it's something that I hope that one day we can go back to for sure. I think it's the preferred method. Excuse me if I pause momentarily. I just do want to keep my eye on the chat. Yeah. Thank you, Sam, for sharing. So now the imperialist agenda, I mentioned that the label of Ottoman Palestine being important. We do know that the Holy Land has a history of colonization and the changing of hands at many different points in history. We can talk about initially the Roman expulsion of the children of Israel, all the way to Ottomans taking control of the land and having it for over 700 years. And then post World War I came the British Mandate, right? The British usurpation of the land and control over the land. I'm sorry, that wasn't post World War I. That was before the end of World War I. So the next few points we're going to be talking about was prior to World War I and the British monarchy's effort to leverage these dynamics in their favor as it was happening. So the imperialist agenda, the British Mandate, first and foremost, the Hussein McMahon correspondence and the Balfour Declaration. So the Hussein McMahon correspondence were an exchange of letters between July of 1915 and January of 1916, which was during World War I, between Hussein ibn Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, and Sir Henry McMahon, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, concerning the political status of lands under the Ottoman Empire. In the letters, Britain agreed to recognize Arab independence after World War I in the limits and boundaries proposed by the Sharif of Mecca. So this language, so the word Arab here is used because this is the Sharif of Mecca. So he's out of the bounds of Palestine, but it was a promise made to him, I guess, as he was seen as a leader of the Arab people. Unfortunately, this is another example of exclusion of Palestinian independence, right? Even within the Arab world. So not including areas in which France had interests. This was in exchange for Arab help in fighting the Ottomans led by Hussein bin Ali. We're not going to go into it, but, we can talk about the Arab revolt within, against the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman rule during World War I, and how that really weakened the Ottomans from the inside of their empire and really led to their downfall. And then secondly, the Balfour Declaration, and this is the exact content of the Balfour Declaration. So the first was the Hussein McMahon correspondence, the British communications with quote unquote Arab leaders promising them autonomy in the land of Palestine. It's insinuated here. And then secondly, the Balfour Declaration, which states His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment of Palestine, a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this objective. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. A funny story, really quick side note, is when I was in college, my senior year in 2015, November 2nd is the anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. They had the General Consulate of Israel in New York come to the university and speak. And so obviously I had to attend. And so I had him read the Balfour Declaration. So he read it one time and then I raised my hand. I was like, can you read that again? Even though he had it up, and all so that he could say, establishment in Palestine of a national home. And then at the end, I pointed that out to him. He was like, well, just because it was called Palestine doesn't mean Palestinians existed. And like my jaw just dropped and was like, yeah, okay. It says a lot about your intellect. Nonetheless, so those are two promises made to the two sides by the British Empire and their involvement in this, unwarranted involvement in this entire context. So what happened? World War I ends, the Allied powers win. And what came out of that was the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which divided the Middle East. What did that look like? Syria and Lebanon was put into the control of the French. Palestine, Transjordan at the time, Jordan and Iraq were put under British control. So in reality, neither side was given what they were promised, right? And so imperialist agenda was at the forefront and really took over the conversation. And we saw the split of the Middle East in this way. Yeah, I agree, Sally. You asked how can they talk about creating a national home for Jews without affecting others' rights? I mean, we're seeing how that is not possible, and of course, we've seen it in other ways in the world. So after the Great Lie, let's call it the Sykes-Picot Agreement, we saw a Palestinian revolt, and then we saw a dedication to terrorism by the Irga and the Haganah. If anybody knows Hebrew, Haganah means defense, and the Haganah is actually evolved into what the IDF is today. In response to the Palestinian revolt and actions by the Irgun and the Haganah, the British government resulted to a military-style occupation of the Holy Land. And of course, we all know that military-style occupations don't breed peace and quiet. Rather, they breed enhanced resistance, right? And so what that led to was the uncontested partition of Palestine in the United Nations led by Britain. So the partition plan was a Zionist state on 57% of the land for 33% of the population. And a Palestinian state on 43% of the land for 67% of the population at that time. I want everybody to take a second for me and take a look at that map on the right side of the frame. So the partition plan was introduced in 1947. Can anybody, I'm gonna give about 30 seconds, write into the chat what I'm looking at. If you can read my mind, what am I looking at in this, on this map? Thank you, Adam. So what I'm looking at, I hope you all can see my mouse. Under Palestine UN Partition Plan 1947, we have a representation of the land, right? And this is a UN map where it's referred to as the Arab state, again, and the Jewish state, right? So it's these little things that are not necessarily explicit, but really affect our perception. Of reality, right? And affect our narrative and how we talk about things. So I think it was something very worthy pointing out. I forgot to use my great animation and do Arab and Jewish, as we discussed previously. And so what that led to was the Nakba, as known within Palestinian society and culture. It led to the 1948 massacres. So, of course, so two very important factors here, right? We mentioned how Palestine had already been under occupation for hundreds of years, right? So Palestinians did not have a formal army. Another thing we talked about was European Jewish migration to Palestine. And so the European understanding of warfare was much different. And so there was a severe tactical disadvantage, to the Palestinian side in this equation. And so, the narratives also pushed that like it was like X amount of Arab countries fighting against just, one Zionist army, which isn't true. I think if you look at the numbers in detail, it's not at all. I think it's like 6-1 is the ratio that's always spewed out. But even then, the numbers don't break down that way. Nonetheless, so Zionist leaders used massacres to spread fear among villages. A total of 531 villages were depopulated and destroyed or occupied by Zionists, and 750,000 Palestinians were forced into exile. We talk about Sheikh Jarrah now, and we talk about Silwan. The reality of the matter is that every single Israeli village was once Sheikh Jarrah or Silwan, right? Just as any region within the United States, within Canada, and so many other lands across the world were once inhabited by folks who are native to the land and then were either murdered or dispelled, right? So we definitely have to keep that in our minds when we have the conversation about Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan, in that they are not unique, unfortunately, right? It's just that the different elements are coming into play right now really made it a hot button, hot topic issue in today's conversation. So the 1948 massacres, Deir Yassin, April 9th, 1948, the Haganah Irgun Stern Gang, led by Yitzhak Rabin, who later on became the prime minister, Menachem Begin, who also became prime minister, pillaged the village, killing 100 plus Palestinians, and it was the early beginning of Palestinian dispossession. The Nasruddin massacre, April 13th through 14th, 1948. The Irgun, disguised as Palestinians, entered the village. 40 villagers survived. No homes were left standing. This one, I'm gonna be honest, gets me the most. The Tantura massacre, May 22nd, 1948. It was a fishing village near the Mediterranean coast. 1,700 villagers total inside of that village. 200 plus villagers were massacred. Today, the land is a beach parking lot. Khan Yunis on November 3rd, 1956. It was so look at that jump in dates. So we have a 1948 and we have 1956. So Khan Yunis was a refugee camp of expelled Palestinians in Gaza. So it was a village invaded and 200 Palestinians were executed in cold blood. I think, to be specific, literally lined up against a wall and shot. So the Nakba today, right? I mentioned briefly Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah, right? So today what the Nakba looks like is a systemic dispossession of Palestinians. It is outright dispossession of Palestinians from their homes, daily dispossessions of Palestinians from their homes, and annexation of the West Bank, and construction of new settlements. So, if we took a look at one moment, I'm sorry. The peace treaties of the mid-90s, and we look at the number of settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, the numbers are approximately a third of this 463,000 and 300,000, right? So those quote unquote peace deals only resulted in additional annexation and settlement in Palestinian lands. So that is the time frame that we're looking about when we talk about Nakba today in relation to settlement expansion, from Oslo Accords, Camp David to today, and what those things actually brought the Palestinian people. So of course, when we talk about Palestine and we talk about the Nakba today, we must talk about Gaza, particularly the siege on Gaza. So the denial of Palestinian human rights in contravention of international law, which amounts to collective punishment. Over 90% of the water from the Gaza aquifer is unsafe for human consumption without treatment. And there are severe import restrictions, including basic building materials. Now, why does basic building materials matter? Well, that's because we've seen since 2008, 4 major assaults on Gaza, which have really destroyed infrastructure beyond, obviously. So I want to be clear here. I want to give a clear disclaimer that Palestinians are more than just numbers, right? Their lives, their homes, schools, hospitals are not just numbers. So pardon me for listing this information on this slide the way I did, but I don't want people to see these as numbers. I want to make very clear that these are people, that this is live, these are lives, this is an existence at stake. Give me a brief second to look. Yeah, and right, fathers, mothers, children, and so on and so forth. Sorry. accidentally skipped a slide. Okay. So I want to give that disclaimer. In 2008, the 3-week assault where we saw 1,417 Palestinians murdered. In 2012 and 8, the assault 177 murders. A 6-week assault, 2,200 murders, and then the most recent 11-day assault, over 250 murders. Now, this I haven't gone into depth here with the numbers as far as children. There is so much information to be learned about the use of intentional damage to infrastructure as a means of warfare by the Zionist state, right? Whether that be, power grid infrastructure, water infrastructure, homes, media buildings, hospitals. In the most recent assault on Gaza, we saw the Zionist army target the only COVID testing lab in Gaza, right? So it's all beyond just for the purpose of killing. It's also for killing and maiming for long term, right? So to make an entire population destitute is to make them vulnerable and desperate, essentially, right? And so when the vulnerable take desperate actions, then we see all the time with the Zionist state pointing the finger like, no, it's their fault, right? They're the ones resisting. They're the ones who won't be quiet. They're the ones who won't allow us to live comfortably, despite all of this trauma and oppression being forced upon the Palestinian people. So the Nakba today, these are just some graphics to really represent what it is, what it looks like today. Adam mentioned, I believe it was Adam mentioned in the chat, the distribution of water. I want everybody, if you can, Google visualizing Palestine. So let me do this real quick. Excuse me. Okay, so I wanted to expand this and so that we can talk about. Have it open. Hope everybody can see. So this is just an example of, London's obviously known for its rainfall. It has, sorry. There it is. So the question is there not enough water in the West Bank? So Ramallah has more annual rainfall than London. Now, Israel takes over 80% of the water from the mountain aquifer each year. Appropriation of water resources. Israeli authorities control all major water sources in the West Bank and determine how much water Palestinians can use. There's also a control of supply. Israeli authorities enforce annual quotas on the amount of water available to the Palestinians. And obstruction of development. No new Palestinian wells approved by Israeli authorities in the most productive Western aquifer since 1967. And then finally, destruction of infrastructure. In 2011, the Israeli military demolished 89 water-related structures, including 21 wells. And this is in West Bank. This is not in Gaza, like we just previously talked about. And 34 rainwater cisterns, essential for agriculture and herding. This is an example of how much water is available by Palestinian per capita, I guess you can say, to each, I don't want to use side, but we're going to use side for lack of better terms at this time. And the World Health Organization recommends 100 liters per day per person. The other graphics that we have here represent, the one on the top right represents the abuse of children, also checkpoints. this is a schoolgirl going to school. There are so many stories out there about Palestinian children being harassed on the way to school. The bottom left, quite literally, destruction of homes. So just like we see in the US, the argument is, well, permitting issues, right? Well, this home didn't have proper permits, so it must come down. But when the system, the institution itself is extremely racist and intentionally racist, obviously people are not going to get the permits. They're not going to be issued the permits that would be required. Because as long as you can deny them that aspect, then you always have your argument to destroy homes, destroy other infrastructure. And then the bottom right, the detention of Palestinians as political prisoners. Those are all examples of how the Nakba exists today in more implicit ways than explicit massacres, all of which culminate into a very bad situation for Palestinians. So the next slide is just the flyer for our series of events that I will cover momentarily, but that's all I have. I hope that was a good, we're talking about an hour time frame here. It is 9:47, so I do want to leave at least 15 minutes for folks to ask questions. Thank you all so much. Please feel free to throw some questions in the Q&A or in the chat if you want. I will be reviewing both right now to see if I have anything. Right. And yeah, Renee, thank you for sharing, right? Because of course, Palestinians have a connection to the land that is generations, generations, and generations old. So Renee wrote into the chat, I'm assuming that it was in response to me talking about permitting. She said, Renee said, or the houses have been in families for hundreds of years, and there was no such thing as deeds in the 17th century. This happened to Renee's brother-in-law's family. Reading materials, absolutely. I would look into Rashid Khalidi. He is a professor and an author. I think that it's a good place to start. Hatem Bezian is also a great scholar. So Rashid Khalidi and Hatem. Rashid Khalidi is R-A-S. I don't want to get it wrong because the end can be spelled two ways. R-A-S-H-I-D. R-A-S-H-I-D. Yes. Thank you, Emily, for that. Quick thinking. So John asked, or John wrote, I have read that Palestinian national identity as such in part in response to, as such developed in part in response to the Zionist settler colonialism. Is that correct? No, that is not correct. Because, Palestine, and a simple, it's not empirical evidence, but evidence is more of a, Palestinian culture is very deep. And if you look into Palestinian culture, it is very different from Lebanese culture. It is very different from Syrian culture. It's very different from Jordanian culture, right? So the Palestinian identity existed well before Zionist settler colonial aspirations. I'm gonna put a word into here. And I don't need empirical evidence to dispute that, right? If we talk about Tatriz and we talk about Kufiyya and we talk about Palestinian cuisine such as Makluba or Mlokhiyya, and these are just words I'm sharing that people should copy and keep and look into these things and look at the origins and look at how deeply rooted, how developed these cultural elements are. And that is a very easy way to dispute that argument, is to show that it's, existed well before all of that. I do think I have a few questions in the Q&A. Linval asked, do you think a two-state solution will ever be possible? What's the word I'm looking for? Practically speaking, a two-state solution is not possible, right? The context in which Palestine exists today, it is as a colonial subject, right? Not as an independent state, country, as an independent people, right? So in order for Palestinians to truly be afforded their rights, their dignity as a people, things need to be undone, right? We can't just go forward. That's like saying, can we have a state for the native peoples in this land on the reservations? There's no continuous land. There is no independent access to resources. So things need to be undone in order for Palestinian dignity to be maintained. And then also, honestly, as a Palestinian, I don't accept that I won't be able to access lands of historical Palestine. Now, the question is, what is the alternative? Simple: a democratic, human rights respecting institution where people have access to all that they need, including freedom of movement. Renee asked, how do we gain support from Americans who have been brainwashed by the mainstream media? Luckily, social movements are really undoing these decades of lies that we've been fed, right? I think what really carried the movement for Palestine in May and this past spring was it was a springboard off of the movement for Black Lives, right? Because Black Lives Matter got involved, and so many other sectors of the social justice movement got involved in the issue for Palestine, right? So we gained support from Americans who've been brainwashed by really diving into social movements. We counter the brainwashing of mainstream media and all this information by talking about why Black Lives Matter, by talking about Native folks in this country, and then the connection between the two are very easily made, right? Because they are symptoms of white supremacy. They are symptoms of settler colonialism on both ends. Although the two struggles may be different in nature, the origins of why the struggles exist can be linked very closely. Virginia asked, how did the first Jewish settlers manage to get land in Palestine before the Balfour Declaration? So just to be clear, the Balfour Declaration did not give land. It was a promise. They bought land, much of them. So they bought and settled, and much of the early Jewish settlement in Palestine didn't necessarily come at the expense of Palestinians, right? And then also they bought land from Palestinians. Now, there should not be any contention to Jewish ownership of land, right? In the Holy Land, in Palestine, especially because there's such a rich and deep connection between the Jewish faith and the Holy Land. Now, to answer, that was my answer to your question, is that they bought and settled land, and not necessarily in ways that were problematic, the early settlements. And so, the issue became not so much that they settled on land, but rather the ethno-supremacist vibe, the ethno-supremacist policies that followed, and the marginalization and then the subsequent removal of Palestinians and the oppression of Palestinians. I hope that answered your question or was sufficient. Thank you, Brian, for sharing your thoughts. So we have about 5 minutes left. I appreciate everybody so much for coming. I want to give just a minute to see if anybody has any additional questions. Jeff and Adam, please feel free to chime in if you have anything to say at this time. I thank everybody so much for joining us. I hope that you were able to take something from today. I'm always willing to talk and to further the conversation. I'm going to drop my email address into the chat. Feel free to reach out with any questions. If anybody wants additional resources, I can share resources via email and be more specific than I was. That is my email. So before I let everybody go, I want to really emphasize the importance of our sessions coming up. Today's is, I think went well, and I'm very happy. So we have July 13th next week, which is going to be on the U.S. complicity in Israel's crimes. Jeff, would you like to share about our guests who are joining us?
Yeah, we have Phyllis Bennis joining us from Institute for Policy Studies, Ray Girard from Democracy for the Arab World Now, and James Zogby from the Arab American Institute. And we're really looking forward to next week. And this was a great start. So now we're even looking forward to it all the more. So great job, Lucy.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And then on, I believe there may be a shift in topics between the 20th and the 27th. The third listed, which I believe might go on the 27th, is going to be about building solidarity and community in this political moment. Talk about, the solidarity between Black Lives Matter movement and other movements in this country, and talk about how movements are interconnected and really need the support of one another to get to where we need to be. And then finally talk about anti-Semitism today, because we see that anti-Semitism in today's world is weaponized against advocates for Palestine, right? And as a non-Jew from the outside, what gets me the most is, there is very, very real anti-Semitism in today's world. And that usually comes from the right. That usually comes from, the people who are spewing hate at everybody else. So I'm excited to see our coalition tackle that issue and talk about anti-Semitism in a critical light, and talk about it as, without letting folks who are really pushing, anti-Semitic rhetoric, without letting them off the hook. So I really hope, I'm excited for these next three events. I will be there. I hope everybody else will join. I'm excited to continue and to hear what everybody says. So thank you all so much for joining us. Am I missing? I see a few. Thank you, everybody. I hope you did enjoy this presentation. I hope you do think that it was good. Gonna go ahead and see if there's anything. Would I support one state? Yeah, absolutely. I advocate for a state with equal rights for all, and access to all. I think that, the Holy Land is such an important area to so many people, primarily the three Abrahamic religions, and then folks who might be culturally associating with, but not necessarily following the religion. So I do think that, access to the Holy Land for anybody who feels connection to the Holy Land is very important. Let me take a look. I'm reading Emily's comment in the Q&A. I'm sorry, Emily, I'm having a bit of a hard time grasping the question. I would love to discuss with you offline if you'd like, but I don't want to hold anybody up any longer. But thank you all so much for joining us. I do believe it's 8 o'clock, so that's all the time we have. But please join us on the other events. Feel free to reach out to the email listed on the flyer here with any questions or concerns. If you feel that there's something that wasn't addressed here, we'll definitely go out of our way to make sure that we address it in the future. So thankfully, this is not a one-time thing. We have a lot of time left together. So thank you everybody so much for joining us this evening. I appreciate you. We'll see you next time.
Well done, Wasim.
Thank you, Ed.
Great job.
Thank you, Jeff. Jeff, would you like to stop the recording? No,
I'm gonna, yeah.